We'll continue our study of Tel Gezer with this second video. At this time, we'll turn our attention to reconstructing as best we can the history of this site using various resources, biblical account, Egyptian accounts, and also what's uncovered through the process of archaeology. There is some evidence of occupation in the Chalcolithic era, and there you see on the far left column. The dates that show up in the second column come to us from Dever's report of the site, part 2. What you see in the third column then are the strata that Dever indicates. I believe in the earlier video I indicated there were 21 strata. To correct that, it should read 26 strata. And that does contrast a lesser number of strata that were identified by McAllister. These are the more officially accepted quantity. The evidence of occupation in Chalcolithic is indicated by what McAllister calls creamware. I haven't located any photos of this. I presume it just has to do with the texture and perhaps a light color. And notice then that just beneath this, or at this point, we're working with bedrock. The creamware was found in some cracks in the bedrock, and it's inferred that what was going on here were primitive campsites. In the early Bronze Age 1, we find that there was no fortification at the Tel Gezer site. In fact, the early dwellings were cave dwellings. Subsequently, those were used for storage and sometimes for burials. At the point of early Bronze II, while the evidence is not strong, they infer that the occupation may have actually covered much of the mound. It's observed that absence of fortifications at this time sets Gezer apart from some of the other cities of that time, such as Tel El Farah up in the north, Megiddo and Ta'anach, as well as Ai, Jericho, and Arad. So we conclude that Gezer was not a significant city at this time. Subsequent to that, there's a gap in occupation. You can see this in the early Bronze III, Middle Bronze I period. Archaeologists are uncertain whether this was due to destruction or just for some other reason people seemed to have abandoned this site. It's when we come to Middle Bronze II that Gezer enjoys considerable expansion. In fact, Ortiz calls it the zenith period for this particular habitation. Not yet fortified, and yet the homes show that they were well planned, well constructed. There are courtyards, there are plaster floors, there are rock-hewn cisterns, and these collect water through runoff systems. Floors are sealed against moisture and rodents, we read, by a coat of plaster up to 15 centimeters thick. That comes from Dever's Encyclopedia article. Pottery is of a delicate eggshell ware, and clearly this has been turned on a fast potter's wheel, sometimes painted or covered with a red slip, beautifully burnished. A substantial wall is now built around the city. It is 13.1 feet thick. Along the wall are towers. McAllister and Rowe found 9 towers and estimate that if they were to have completed the excavation of this particular structure, they would have found perhaps 25, just extrapolating on how frequently they occur. This refers to what's called the inner wall. Part of this inner wall was the south gate. We'll point that out later. That south gate is flanked on the west by a tower, Tower 5017 it's called. As to dimension, it is 15.6 meters in width, so triple that for feet, about 48 feet wide. And Dever describes it as the largest single-phase defense work known in the country. At some points, that inner wall still exists or has been found to a height of 4.5 meters, so 13 to 14 feet high. Reinforcing this inner wall was a glacis, that is a slope of additional soil packed in around the base of the outer edge. And later on we'll show you a picture of this. There's a rather intriguing pattern, almost a zigzag of bright soil interlaced with dark soil. So that is the inner wall, and it's Middle Bronze 2. In the row labeled Middle Bronze 2 A/B, under the column labeled Findings, you'll see it reads that this era ended with a 1 meter thick layer of destruction, evidenced by burned bricks. Deaver writes that this was evidenced in every field investigated. Field here is a technical term referring to zones of excavation. You'll see there's field 1, field 2, field 3, and those on the map are surrounded or indicated by various rectangular lines. Deaver writes, along the inner face of the city wall, that would be the inner wall, just to the west of the south gate, a row of hovels and storerooms was found containing quantities of grain-filled storage jars and other vessels, crushed under an accumulation of burned beams, ash, fallen mud bricks, and collapse from the wall. As you can imagine, for there to be a store of grain left behind and burned means that there must have been some kind of a sudden demise, preventing the owners of that important food material from retrieving it and escaping somewhere. Deaver continues, observing that the kind of pottery, including some imported monochrome ware, helped them to date this as late as possible in this time frame, late Bronze Age. And he writes, provisionally, it can be correlated with the first campaign of Thutmose III about 1468 BCE, which is when this pharaoh claims to have destroyed Gezer. Now, Thutmose III reigned from approximately 1490 to 1436 BC, and at Karnak on the Nile, in the great temple of Amun located there, we find a scene that depicts this pharaoh's victories in his first military campaign up into Asia. We find there the depiction of bound captives from Gezer. Continuing with Middle Bronze 2C, you'll see reference there to the inner wall fortifications already mentioned. And now the high place, which is decorated with 10 enormous standing stones or monoliths and some infant burial jars. Initially, when McAllister came to the site, he just saw, as it were, little fingers of stone protruding. And as he excavated, then these turned out to be enormous upright stones. You might think of them somewhat like Stonehenge, obviously a smaller version. But McAllister recorded their height. Some were 5 foot 5 inches high, and the tallest reaches 10 foot 6 inches high. He notes that they are unhewn, so they are raw stones, not a polished sort. In addition, there was one which was more cube-shaped, a lower squat stone, a very large one. We'll show pictures of these all later. And within it then was excavated a square or cubic territory. The function of that, was it a sacrificial place? Was it a laver to have water in it? Was it the base upon which a large column, perhaps a wooden column, then was anchored? We'll come back to this later, but we want to locate it in terms of the history of the site as late within the Middle Bronze period. And now the mention of infant burial jars. Later excavators discovered that these were dated earlier than the monoliths, but they are in the same area. McAllister thought they were contemporaneous with the monoliths. So it's inferred then the monoliths had some cultic or religious significance, and we'll talk about some speculation of what it may have been. And these infants their corpses were within burial jars, and we'll show that to you as well. I should make one comment concerning mention of the destruction layer at the end of Middle Bronze II, and then continuing to talk about inner wall fortifications, monoliths, and burial jars, and so forth. In one article, Dever states that this marks the end of Middle Bronze II, and then in other resources, the dates of that seem to be a little bit in conflict. So the Thutmose III, his campaign 1468 seems to be fairly well established. That being the case, it seems like that should mark the end of Middle Bronze II, and yet some of the records are a bit inconsistent in that regard. You read one writer's record of the site and another writer's record of the site. It doesn't always conform. Also to this Middle Bronze II era belong some unusual ovens that they find in the courtyards. You'll see a picture of these, and they are constructed of taking the shoulder and head of a storage jar. So just picture the taper of the head, that neck, and then the flare of the shoulder of a large storage jar. Then imagine slicing it off right at that point, turning it upside down so it looks like a bowl, a large bowl with a drain in it. That would be the neck of it. And we find these submerged into the floor level. You'll see a picture of these. So that's a Middle Bronze II feature. They also found several tombs that were quite rich with scarabs. Those are the little seals with inscription on them, and some gold jewelry, some alabaster vessels as well. As the Late Bronze Age begins, we find little representation of occupation, and so it's hypothesized that perhaps after Thutmose III and his destruction, perhaps the place was vacated for a time. The raid recorded for Thutmose IV may have occurred in this period as well. We find in the mortuary temple of Thutmose IV at Thebes an inscription that talks about him retrieving some Hurrian captives from a city. Hurrians would again be inhabitants actually even north of Palestine. And the city from which he captured them, the designation of it in the Thebes record is damaged, but it's surmised that what they can read, it may have referred to Gezer. Thutmose IV, 1410 to 1402 BC. When we come to Late Bronze IIa, this would be stratum 16. Here the outer wall will be constructed, and this is the era attested by the Amarna letters, and we can tell from this that Gezer, among other sites in the Canaan territory, is under Egyptian domination. The outer wall, constructed at this time, enclosed about 25% more acreage than the inner wall. In width, it averaged 4 meters, and in height is extant as much as 4.5 meters. The walls of domestic enclosures boast a width as much as 2 meters. Imagine a house wall that's 6 feet wide, 6 feet thick. Floor surfaces show evidence of being plastered, so a nice finishing of the floor surface. There were drains covered over with stone caps. One of the artifacts that was recovered is a bronze serpent in length about 15 centimeters. It's surmised that a water tunnel system was constructed at this time. They have a bit of difficulty dating it because the excavation techniques of McAllister created an incision, a cutting off that disrupted their ability to connect some of the time-related information. Dever writes that a keyhole-shaped flight of steps and a round shaft of about 7 meters deep led to a sloping tunnel some 45 meters long. You'll see a diagram of this on the map, and there'll be a photo where you'll see a depression that indicates the access point. But what may be easy to lose track of is the fact that the tunnel underneath runs for about 150 feet. And that leads to an enlarged cavern at the end where they have access to the water. Evidently, Gezer was partly abandoned as we come to the end of Late Bronze. The quality of the buildings declines, and the quantity of imported ware also becomes more scarce. As to marking the close of stratum 15, that's Late Bronze 2B, it's a bit difficult to discern for certain because there's destruction in some zones indicated by smashed pottery and a heavily burned courtyard, but then another field will show no signs of destruction. Perhaps what we have here is evidence of a break in occupation at the end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th centuries, and that's what you see as row labeled Late Bronze 2/Iron 1. In an effort to account for this, one theory would be that Pharaoh Merneptah has rolled into this territory. You'll recall the Merneptah Stela indicating around 1207 his campaign out of Egypt and up into Canaan. Incidentally, McAllister found a cartouche of Merneptah inscribed on a sundial. Perhaps that's evidence of Merneptah's destruction at this point. Another possibility would be that the Philistines coming in or the Sea Peoples coming in the early 12th century brought devastation to this site. A third possibility is that this could be Israelite destruction associated with Joshua.